Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Pollock. I am a professor at McGill University in Montreal, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about protecting the tree of life, both currently and into the future. I won't go into the details of why, because this is what we're talking in this symposium, and we can have a nice discussion about this later. But in general, we want to protect our evolutionary heritage. That's why we might want to think about phylogenetic diversity and conservation. We want to keep our options open. So we want to protect, pools of important biodiversity that might not be actively contributing to human well-being, but it might in the future. So today, my case study is eucalypts, and they have, for example, thousands or millions probably of secondary compounds in their leaves. And some of them we know are important from a pharmaceutical perspective, but there are a whole bunch of chemicals that we don't even know about. So if we protect one species of eucalypts, then we're definitely limiting ourselves from all of that diversity that's out there. Also, areas that have a lot of phylogenetic diversity also maybe have a lot of evolutionary potential. There's a lot there, right? There's a lot of branches on the phylogeny there. So the potential that one of those might be able to adapt to future conditions might be higher. Also, phylogenetic diversity is a surrogate for other things. There's potentially less taxonomic bias. If we're looking at species richness, it's really dependent on how many species have people named in an area. Phylogenetic diversity buffers that a little bit, so there's slightly less taxonomic bias. And we've already talked about some species-based metrics, like the edge list. And so today I'm focusing on area-based metrics. And so this is how do we select areas that have a whole bunch of really important species in them, or areas that contribute a whole bunch to the total phylogenetic diversity in a region, for example. And the main metric that we use in conservation planning, where we're trying to optimize the areas that we would choose to protect, this metric is usually based around this metric of phylogenetic endemism. And phylogenetic endemism, again, I'm not going to go into the details of the metric, but this is generally what it does. And so if you think of each of these little yellow blocks could be considered a planning unit. So an area that you might be able to choose, should we choose one of these areas or another area? And so if you think about one area and it's got two species, it's got species A, it has the entire distribution of species A. So that's really important for species A, obviously. If we would protect anywhere else, we would be missing that entire species. It's also got a portion of species E, maybe 10% of the distribution of species E. And so what phylogenetic endemism does is it takes all of those proportions of the distributions of each species and adds them up, basically. And so when we're thinking about the phylogeny, it's now branches. It's the proportion of the distribution of each branch on the phylogeny that could be protected if you were to select that particular area for conservation. And so it's a really nice metric because it's scalable. In total, if everything's protected, it equals phylogenetic diversity. And also it can be used if you add or take away areas. So you know how much is added or subtracted onto your total phylogenetic diversity that's maybe already protected in protected areas, for example. So that's all great, except the fact that we know that a lot of species are shifting their ranges with climate change. And so how do we merge these two things where we have projections of climate change, right? We have areas where we think species might be going, and we need to also protect these pools of biodiversity. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And so just generally speaking, what we do in these optimization problems typically is we use different types of uncertainty to describe the different portions of the range of a species. And so areas that are stable, so those are areas that have a species now, and they also are likely to have the species in the future because that species is still well within its climate range. It's well within the conditions that it's currently in. So those are kind of win-win areas, and we basically rank those a bit higher. We weight those higher in the spatial prioritization. We also have areas where the species is now, but climatically it's really, really different. And so it might disappear. So we still want to take those areas into consideration, right? The species is still there, but we don't want to weight them quite as highly because it's possible that species will leave in the future. Then we have areas that don't currently have the species, but might in the future based on our climate projections. These are super uncertain, right? We have no idea if that species can't even move there. There might be a barrier preventing that species from moving there. But we don't want to discount those because we have areas that might become suitable for a whole bunch of species. And so we don't want to necessarily throw those out from the consideration. So we keep them in, but we weight them a little bit less than we would these stable win-win areas. And so this is just a case study of eucalypts. So we have 700 species. So eucalypts are a hyperdiverse clade, and they dominate many forests around Australia. So it's convenient because they provide a whole bunch of habitat for other species, and they all have a nice phylogeny. So we can take into account the difference between a species-based prioritization and a phylogenetic-based prioritization, for example. And so we have climate projections for all of these species. We have different types of scenarios, if they are able to disperse, if they're not able to disperse. And just very briefly, I will tell you that the climate projections are not necessarily good for these species. We have 90% of the species are shrinking in their distribution according to the climate models, and 3% actually end up entirely outside of their climate space. And this is just a representation of which parts of the branch of the phylogeny are protected currently. So this is the current system of protected areas. And I've just zoomed in. It's really hard to see the whole phylogeny here. So I've just zoomed in, and you can see here that each branch, the color of the branch represents how much of that branch is currently protected. So if it's black or dark red or even red, it means that less than 10% of the distribution of that branch of the phylogeny is protected. So very little of that branch is currently protected. Okay, anything that's in blue is a little more than that. It's about 10 to 50% protected. So things that we don't necessarily need to worry about as much. And anything that is in yellow is more than 50% protected. That really only happens in the expansion scenario. So the top is what's protected currently. The bottom is what could be protected, if we were to expand protected areas 5%. Okay, so 5% beyond what they currently are, and this again is in Australia, but these kind of numbers are similar for global situations as well, for globally for birds and mammals, for example. So if we were to expand protected areas, we can obviously get a whole bunch more of the phylogeny represented in protected areas. And this is just a map showing where those areas are. And this contrasts different scenarios that we've looked at. And so here in the gray are areas that are already protected. If they don't have a color at all, they don't have a lot of native vegetation, or they don't have a lot of tree vegetation. So we're really interested in these colored bits, because these colored bits, if they're in purple, they represent the top priorities for protecting the phylogeny right now. So protecting the phylogeny based on the distribution of the current distribution of species. If they're dark purple, they are priorities for future distribution, and that's using that whole weighting scheme. So that's prioritizing areas that are basically stable, mostly stable, rather than the areas that might lose a whole bunch of species based on the climate models. And you can see there's a lot of difference in those two areas as to where you would go, which areas that you should protect if you are looking at the current distribution or the current projections versus the future projections. And then you have these orange areas, which are priorities for both things. Okay, and so these again are kind of win-win-win areas, because they're both stable. They have species in the present, they have species in the future based on the whole weighting scheme, and so they're sort of areas that there's more certainty that we're still going to have really important reservoirs of phylogenetic diversity in these areas into the future. And so just on that note, this is all relatively sort of recent ideas about putting these models together, because we have many climate models and a whole bunch of information that we can feed into these climate models. And although they're still highly uncertain, we can use them in this way where we're taking that uncertainty into account and we're propagating it through the optimization. But a lot of questions remain. What portion of these win-win areas should we protect compared to which portion of areas that might become suitable for a whole bunch of future colonization, for example? If we have an area that's maybe really cold and becoming, less cold, it might be more species might be able to move into that area. How do we kind of weigh those differences? How much certainty do we put into these climate projections? And the other really, I think, important next step is to think about connectivity. So where is a species now versus where is it into the future, and how do we link that up? How do we make sure that that species has the stepping stones it needs to migrate its way across the landscape, in the case where it's shifting with climate change? And then how do we then think about that as a pool of diversity? So how do are there areas of connectivity for multiple species, and do those species represent a whole bunch of the phylogeny, for example? And how would we take that into account in these spatial prioritizations? So I'll stop there. But it would be great to speak to anyone about these, and how we can kind of use these scenarios and use them in a more conservation, a more applied conservation context, where we might have specific scenarios of a management action or a reserve expansion, and how we may take these ideas of both the climate change shift as well as this idea of the importance of protecting the tree of life. Thanks, everyone.